Well, hopefully someday we'll be able to do that. That is to bravely and boldly go where others have been before, folks. And that is to borrow a phrase from Richard C. Hoagland, of course. Hello, I'm Jim Rodger, and we have some interesting information and images coming your way. First of all, I want to mention that this documentary is featuring Dr. Claude V. Swanson, a physicist from Princeton University, and also the late Dr. Tom Van Flandern, along with his research and hypothesis. Tom, by the way, was educated at Xavier University, went on to Yale University into a PhD program, obtained his PhD, and then he went to work for the U.S. Naval Observatory for a long career there. Following that, Tom went into private research, which mainly focused on the anomalies, the so-called anomalies, on the surface of Mars. And Tom, by the way, was known for his out-of-the-box views. Tom was never afraid to say that, hey, there's an elephant in the living room here, folks, or the emperor has no clothes on. But Tom's hypothesis was that Mars suffered a major catastrophe a long time ago, approximately 3.2 million years ago. And that catastrophe was from a nearby or adjacent exploding planet that literally pulverized the surface of Mars only on one side of that planet, folks. So Tom's hypothesis is very interesting, and there are many other scientists that agree with Tom's hypothesis. And there are still others that take that a step further. There are many others that believe that not only were there people or beings living and working on the surface of Mars a long time ago by looking at the evidence, that they also think that they may have been high-tech enough to see or recognize an impending disaster or an approaching catastrophe, and that they were perhaps high-tech enough to escape the planet Mars and go to the nearest refuge, which would have been right here on Earth, folks. So perhaps maybe some of our ancient ancestors are actually ancient astronauts from Mars. Who knows? And if this is all true, then this coincides with what archaeologists are finding here below the surface of our planet. They're finding archaeological remains of perfectly anatomically modern human beings, just like you and I, that are about 3.2 million years old, folks. So this is becoming very interesting. So perhaps maybe some of our ancestors are from there. Let's check in with Dr. Van Flandern and begin to learn about this subject.
The solar system back in the 18th century consisted of the Sun and 6 major planets, including the Earth, and there was a gap in the planets between the 4 inner ones out to Mars, and then the 2 large ones, Jupiter and Saturn. And there was a lot of wonderment about why there was this gap. And 2 astronomers, Titius and Bode, predicted a law of planetary spacing that indicated that there ought to be 1 more planet in that gap. Nobody paid much attention to that curiosity until the planet Uranus was discovered, and it fell right in line with the formula. So searches were organized, and eventually a minor planet was discovered in that gap in 1801. And everyone thought, well, that was marvelous, but it was such a tiny thing, and it wasn't even visible to the naked eye. A second minor planet was discovered the next year, and Olbers said, I know what happened. A planet was there and it exploded. And everyone was happy with that explanation until 1814, when Laplace came along and said, and that explains the comets too. But that happened to be stepping on some big toes in astronomy at the time, and that resulted in the exploded planet hypothesis being attacked. And Lagrange became ill and died of an illness that year, and wasn't able to continue the defense of the exploded planet hypothesis. So for historic reasons, it was dismissed at the time, and the solar nebula theory continued. The exploded planet idea has been discovered and rediscovered many times since, and in the modern evidence that I've helped to research, we now see that the solar system, instead of being something that formed 4.5 billion years ago and nothing much has happened since, we see that it has been a place of great change, and that originally there were probably a dozen planets, of which only half survive today, the other 6 having exploded in the interim. And the most recent explosions, the one that affect Earth in geological time, would have been the one in the main asteroid belt and the one in the orbit that Mars now occupies. And those occurred 250 million years ago and 65 million years ago, respectively, the latter being the one that did in the dinosaurs and did a lot of damage on Earth.
Apparently, Tom was talking about 2 different planets that exploded in our solar system. One which was located where the main asteroid belt is right now, and the other one which was located adjacent to Mars. And by the way, I'm kind of glad that things have settled down a little bit in our solar system since then. Although we here on Earth could be struck at any time by an incoming heavenly body, such as a comet or an asteroid. The universe and space is a beautiful place, but it's dangerous, and there are no guarantees out there. Okay, so for example, a planet with a high pressure molten core were to be struck by a high velocity asteroid to the point where its own surface mantle would be violated, what do you think would be left over of a planet like that afterwards? Let's check in with Tom and find out.
If you add up all the mass of all the asteroids in the asteroid belt, the tens of thousands of them, the total mass is still only about 1/1000th of the mass of the Earth. And a lot of people initially thought that that meant that it couldn't have been a planet-sized body that exploded there. However, we now know that if the Earth exploded today, the surface layers and the upper mantle of the Earth would fragment into rocks and become asteroids. But the deeper mantle and the inner parts of the Earth down to the core are under so much pressure from the weight of the overlying layers of rock that below a depth of about 40 kilometers into the Earth, and the Earth is 6,000 kilometers down to the center, everything below about 40 kilometers in an explosion where that rock is suddenly lifted away and released, it would vaporize from the sudden release of pressure. And therefore it would not survive as rocks, it would be vapor and gases and dust in space. So we see that the Earth exploding today would produce only roughly as much mass in asteroids as we find in the main asteroid belt.
Scientists believe that not much would be left of Earth if we suffered a similar fate as did the mother planet of Mars. By the way, there is 1 billion trillion tons of pressure exerted on the molten core of our planet here on Earth. So could you imagine what would happen if our own planet suffered a similar impact as did the mother planet of Mars? Not much would be left over afterwards. On June 19th of 1976, the Viking 1 orbiter was inserted into Martian orbit. Very soon thereafterwards, the famous face of the Cydonia area was discovered. And it wasn't long after that NASA quickly pontificated and said, well, that's just a trick of light and shadow. I don't think so, folks. Tom is next going to lay out some very compelling evidence that contradicts that famous knee-jerk statement of NASA.
Okay, let's consider the case for objects that we see on Mars, such as the famous face on Mars. That could easily be a natural landform, or it could have been an artificial object, something that someone built. Faces can and do occur in nature, but on Earth, in cases where we see natural faces, they tend to be two-dimensional. They're either tricks of light and shadow, or their profiles in 2 dimensions. The only cases for truly 3-dimensional faces, which are very unlikely to arise by accident, cases on Earth are like Mount Rushmore and the Sphinx in Egypt and so on. The Cydonia face is very interesting, the Cydonia face on Mars, because it is a 3-dimensional face and therefore unlikely to be an accident of nature. But the scientists involved designed actually 8 tests altogether to determine whether it was natural or artificial. Artificial meaning built by some intelligence. And some of these are based on what's called, scientists call the a priori principle. The a priori principle works kind of this way. If you play a card game of bridge, 4 players are each dealt 13 cards face down. And if you pick up your 13 cards and it turns out they're all spades, you got all 13 spades in the deck, the odds against that happening by chance are 635 billion to 1. But it turns out that any random hand you are dealt has 13 very specific cards, and the odds against your being dealt that hand are also 635 billion to 1. So in a sense, every hand you're dealt is a miracle at those long odds. What this means is that if you pick up a hand and judge the probability of it happening after the fact, that has no significance. But that probability does apply to the next instance, to it happening again. So here's the difference. If the hand is dealt and the cards are still face down, and you predict every one of the 13 cards accurately, you can be sure that was no accident of chance. And it's similar for the tests we use of the face on Mars. We made some predictions of what would be found when spacecraft went back and measured it again at higher resolution. We made predictions that the unseen shadowed side would be either face-like on that side as it was on the visible half face that we originally saw, or else that it would be random hills or desert or craters or anything natural if the object was natural terrain. And it turned out that it was more or less symmetric on the other side. There were, as I say, altogether 8 tests, and 2 of those tests that I proposed myself were because the face cannot be seen from the ground on Mars as a face, it has to be viewed from above. You would have to be observing from either another planet that it's circling or from an orbiting space station. In either case, you would want to build it on the equator of Mars. But the Cydonia face was at a high northern latitude, which meant it was probably natural, not artificial. And moreover, you would certainly build it upright and not tipped over at an angle so that it could be seen by viewers as a face. And the Cydonia face is tipped at an angle of about 35 degrees. So although of the 8 tests, 6 of them eventually came out in favor of artificiality, those 2 tests that I'd proposed came out in favor of a natural origin. That is, until one day when I was asked the question, you showed evidence that Mars was a former moon of another planet that has since exploded. Lots of evidence such as that Mars is extremely peppered with craters, saturated with craters on one side, and its crust is built up to a thickness of 20 kilometers more than the other side, and the other side is flat, smooth, and almost craterless, completely shielded and protected. And again, indications that it faced an explosion of a nearby planetary body. Well, one of the other things that happened is the Mars poles shifted as the whole planet tipped over from the extra weight that was piled on its equator. And they tipped over till the spin axis went through the heavy side. And so I was asked the question, where was the face on Mars before the cataclysm occurred? Because maybe that cataclysm is what did in the builders and maybe they built before the explosion. And I thought that was a very interesting question, so I computed the location of the old equator from the known location of the old pole of Mars, and it turned out to pass practically right through the face of Mars, meaning that that object was at one time right on the equator of Mars. And then I hastily did the rest of the calculations. Well, how was it oriented with respect to the old equator? And the answer was practically upright. So those two tests have now moved over into the column favoring an artificial origin rather than a natural origin, provided only that the building occurred before the cataclysm. And the estimated date of that event was 3.2 million years ago.
In 1998, the famous face of the Cydonia area of Mars was rephotographed with the new high-resolution Mars Global Surveyor satellite. And it turns out that all the features of the face, the eyebrows, the eyes, the nose, the nostrils, the mouth, and the overall humanistic shape of the face all turned out to be three-dimensional. But here's the thing, that was predicted ahead of time. So the a priori principle that Tom speaks about applies here. So now scientists must pay very serious attention to this. And by the way, the odds of this being an accident far exceed the 635 billion to 1 odds that Tom spoke about in the bridge game. Okay, so now next, Tom's going to show us what he's been talking about.
This is the Cydonia face seen by the Mars Global Surveyor spacecraft in a 1998 image that has been image processed so as to provide better lighting than was actually available at the observing conditions, and the view as it would be from overhead rather than well off to one side. And the significant thing about this image, as opposed to the original discovery image in 1976, which showed only that there was the impression of an eye, a nose, and a mouth. Mm-hmm. Here we see the fulfillment of the scientists' predictions that if somebody built this to be a portrayal of a humanoid face, then there would be secondary facial features, such as the eyebrow over the eye socket, the nostrils at the end of the nose, another eyebrow seen there, that the mouth would consist of parted lips, and so on. The nose is tapered toward the forehead. All of these are characteristics of a humanoid face. They were not seen in the original discovery image, but predicted in advance. Therefore, by the a priori principle, if they come true, then you have to pay attention. It's not an accident.
The a priori rule of science dictates that when a scientist can predict something ahead of time, something that's very complex, then that's no accident. For example, the face of Cydonia is complex. It has eyebrows, eyes, a nose, nostrils, a mouth, and the overall humanistic shape. And when all of these features come together in the proper relationship to each other, then that's not an accident. That is something very complex, and it is something that has been predicted ahead of time. So therefore, from this point onward, science has to take this very seriously and pay very close attention to it. Now, skeptics, on the other hand, have always said, well, if the face of Cydonia really was an ancient monument, they would have placed it on the equator. Well, in our next clip, Tom is going to give very compelling evidence that the face of Cydonia was indeed on the equator a long time ago.
The evidence that the pole of Mars, the geographic pole, shifted. This is not the magnetic pole, which on Earth shifts all the time, but the geographic pole, which is a very odd and rare event. The evidence that it happened is that a planetary geologist named Peter Schultz noticed that craters on Mars that happened in the polar regions were craters that were formed into a deep layer of snow and ice, and as a result, the craters tend to have walls, as all craters do, that go up to the original surface, but then when the polar ice melts away in the spring and summer, the craters are left with these high walls above the ground, and they're called pedestal craters. And it's an unusual formation, and it can only happen when you have a crater forming in a surface that later is melted away. So that having been noted, by chance he discovered, while surveying the surface of Mars, that there was another area somewhere else on Mars in which pedestal craters occurred. And he thought, well, what could that mean except that the pole was there at one time? But that seemed so unlikely, but he proposed a test of it. He said, well, if there was one pole here at this odd location at some time in the past, that would have to be a north or south pole. Its opposite would have to be exactly 180 degrees away on the planet. So we went to that area and found some more pedestal craters, showing that indeed there were two poles, but at a different location at some time in the past. And that pole tip is part of the evidence that Mars did indeed suffer a cataclysm from the explosion of its parent planet at the time and tipped over to a great extent.
Just imagine what a magnificent testament to the achievement of a society that could actually build megalithic monuments on their moon, so that when you walked outside at night you could look up and watch as the moon rotated. You could actually see those monuments going by. What a magnificent achievement. You know, I think any society that advanced, that high-tech, certainly would have had some form of a warning of any type of an impending disaster or catastrophe that might be approaching. And once again, as I previously mentioned, our earliest tracings of anatomically modern humans like you and I do trace back to that same time period. Okay, so far we've learned about exploding planets, polar shifts, pedestal craters, and the face of the Cydonia area. Well, in our next clip, we're going to be taking a look in the Syrtis Major area of the planet Mars at something else very interesting.
This one is called the crown face, is seen in a different region of Mars called Syrtis Major. And we went, this was in a region that looked geologically interesting for unrelated reasons. Just off to this side were some rectangular looking objects that looked a little bit like they might have been buildings or something interesting. And so we wanted to get a picture of what was just off to this side, and when the high resolution picture came back, we saw this amazing view there. And you can see it has, again, the characteristics of a humanoid face. And that's a recurring theme on Mars. And in the Cydonia area, we have seen several humanoid related things in one area. We have seen several aquatic shapes in another area of Cydonia, insect shapes in another area, mammalian shapes in another. Part of what tells us that they're artificial rather than random is that they are organized in an intelligent way. And they have interrelationships as if they're trying to present a story or a theme in a picture.
Amazing. That was the crown face. Once again, all the proportions of that face, the eyebrows, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the overall humanistic shape, all come together, each component in proper relationship to everything else. And that's no accident, friends. And by the way, all the components of this face are three-dimensional. And also, the idea of a society working and living on the surface of Mars back then isn't really that far-fetched at all, because after all, our own mainstream scientists do agree that at one time Mars did have a magnetosphere, an atmosphere, and plenty of water, all of which would have made it easy for workers to work upon the surface of the planet Mars. Okay, we just had a look at what was called the crown face. Now, suppose those ancient monument builders were trying to tell some type of a royal story here. And if they were, would it be fair to show only a crown face, or in other words, a king, without showing a queen? Let's take a look.
This is Nefertiti. This image is also from the Mars Global Surveyor, the one on the left. On the right we have an artistic enhancement to show what is seen there, because the contrast is a little bit low on this computer monitor. But we see that there is quite a bit of detail in this image, which is part of what makes it impressive. It looks like a clearly female face with a very tall and ornate head ornament or crown. Almost the artist doesn't seem to see it, but it almost seems like a ceremonial dress that she's wearing. And in the face, besides the eye, nose, and mouth, the detail of these features is very elaborate, so that in the eye we see an iris and a pupil, and over the eye there are actually 7 radial eyebrows that are in the original image. The next view shows us that in close-up. Here's the original image and the artistically enhanced view. You can see that both the iris and the pupil are visible in the eye shape that is on the image, and the 7 radial eyebrows over the eye. And you can also see that the outline of the face has some relief off the ground too, so that the images are not just made by accidents of light and shadow, but are actually the way the landscape was terraformed.
To me, Nefertiti looks so much like one of our own Egyptian ancestors. It just blows me away, folks. Also, on a different note now, many researchers are absolutely perplexed at a phenomena called track lines that are traveling literally for hundreds of kilometers along the surface of Mars without ever intersecting a crater. To me, if these were truly random lines created by something of nature, they would be intersecting anything and everything on the surface of Mars, but they don't. They never go directly through a crater. Also, these strange track lines appear to have actually cultivated the soil along the edges of them, where what appears to be trees growing there. One person who was 95% convinced of this was Sir Arthur C. Clarke. Okay, so let's now take a look at track lines and trees.
Here's an area of Mars where we have very linear tracks across the desert sands. The tracks have sculpted out a trail through the sand. It's rather wide, a couple hundred meters wide, and it has these ridge-like tracks down the middle of it. And the odd thing about the tracks, they extend over great distances across the surfaces, hundreds of kilometers long, yet they always seem to avoid the craters. None of them cuts through craters, but many of them just graze by the edges of craters, tangent to them. In the next one, we see here in a low-resolution image that these tracks go for hundreds of kilometers across the surface. And here are 3 cases of parallel tracks. Here's another fainter one up here. And we took a high-resolution image here. I should be using the pointer, where you see the box. I can also do this. Here's where we took the high-resolution view that is seen over here, and we can see that track is a channel through the surface, again with something like tread marks in the interior. And we couldn't even tell that there was a crater there in the low-resolution view, but again, it happens to be passing just tangent to a crater, as all of these do, rather than cutting through craters. Here's a track that has a fork in the road, and we see something else here that is common with these tracks, which is that they seem to be lined with dark areas alongside of them that look somewhat vegetative, just as many of the pathways and trails we have on Earth are lined with vegetation. There is something that looks like vegetation on Mars. Here's a case of a trail with a right angle turn that then veers left again, also lined with shrub-like things. Here is a case of a strong track or trail lined with much thicker vegetation. You can see the branch structure now. In the next view, we can see some of these vegetative items at a slightly different season, and their spindly branch-like character is very much in evidence. And here we see, at two different seasons, much thicker vegetation yet, and the fractal character that it has. And finally we see some of the larger individual members of this collection, such as this one, or this one. There's a central trunk-like area with branch structures at several levels, and they cast shadows onto the ground below them. This one would be about 100 meters across, which would be easier to support in the lower gravity field of Mars than on Earth. And it must be at least 50 meters off the ground because of the shadows that it's casting. And here's what Sir Arthur Clarke had to say about that particular picture. The recent discovery of life in the most improbable places, especially far down inside the Earth's crust, has now convinced me that we have been equally short-sighted. Some of the amazing images from the Mars Surveyor, especially the one we just saw, make me 95% sure that there are extensive areas of vegetation or its equivalent on Mars.
Okay, we have strange track lines running for hundreds of kilometers across the surface of Mars, without ever passing through a crater. Seems to me that if these lines were randomly generated, that they would be passing through craters, but they don't. Well, here's a theory. Perhaps those ancient monument builders were actually strip mining up there on the surface of Mars millions of years ago, and maybe those track lines are scars from strip mining equipment that was operating there. And just imagine, if you were operating a strip mining machine, wouldn't you avoid the hardly impacted craters and plan your path so as to avoid them? I would. And what about those tree-like looking structures? They sure look like trees to me. And remember, trees don't need an oxygen environment like we have here on Earth. Trees don't need oxygen, they make oxygen. Okay, next we're going to take a look at another very controversial feature on the surface of Mars, something called the glassy tubes.
This is a feature that has come to be nicknamed the glassy tubes. We only see those in areas where the water has eroded away the surface and revealed what is obviously an underground feature normally. There are some places where the erosion is very mild and we just see the rib structure at the ground level, and there are other places such as this where the erosion is deep and we can see intersecting tubes coming in and going out in three different directions. Here's a magnified view of the one on the left, and it has these bright ribs that are encircling it. Faintly between the bright ribs we can see the undersides where the ribs completely encircle the tubes, and that indicates that the tubes are indeed three-dimensional and translucent. And here we see a specular reflection of sunlight. You don't get specular reflections off natural surfaces that suggest something glassy or metallic or plasticky to produce such a bright reflection. Here's another example of a tube that's visible in a cracked area of the surface, showing the glassy character of the tube. In this case, we have some tubes on the Cydonia plateau magnified over here. The tube sections are broken, but we can see they cast distinct shadows, showing their three-dimensional character. Here are some places where the surface is eroded away, and we can see hints of nests of tubes below the surface. Here's a case of a Y junction in a tube. This is again at Cydonia, showing that the tubes do not go randomly below the surface, but they connect interesting places. This snapshot of Cydonia shows the face up here, the mesa south of the face here, and the so-called fortress feature here. At the top of the fortress feature, in the middle of this wall, on the side of the fortress nearest the face, there is a dark area, and if we look at that in high resolution, that dark area, this is the back wall all by itself, it's seen to be a glassy tube coming out from the middle of that wall of the fortress and goes out a short distance and then disappears underground. More recently, we have infrared images which can see a short distance beneath the surface. And in those infrared images, here again is the fortress feature with the tube coming out. And in the infrared images, we can see that the tube actually is, the track of the tube below the surface is visible as it bends its path to go down and intersect the middle of the next mesa down. And it is also possible on a better monitor than this to trace another path of the tube that goes up to the face mesa and goes into the middle of it. So the tubes aren't just running randomly around, they're connecting the interesting places. Here's a case of a crater that seems to have a large fissure almost all the way around, and there's another fissure going by it, seen in this low resolution view, going from another interesting place on the high side down to another one on the south. And here's a white box where we took a high resolution view, and we see that inside those fissures are glassy tubes. And assuming that what we see in the high resolution view clearly here is true of everywhere that there are fissures, then the glassy tubes go in and circle the crater, come out again, and go on past the crater down to the next interesting feature on the surface. It's the sort of path that visitors might want to follow. Here is a place where the tubes again are seen to be nested below the surface, and in one place we have a tube that crosses perpendicularly under another tube where the rib structures are north-south in one case and east-west in the other, so that they're cross-hatched in this area. Again, that shows that they are clearly translucent because you can see the underneath tube right through the top tube, and it also rules out some of the other explanations that have been offered that were a little implausible anyway, such as sand dunes or lava tubes, because those can't be mutually perpendicular at the same place at the same time. This is one that clearly shows the difference between an intact three-dimensional tube and its intact rib structure with broken sections. We see here a boulder that has rolled in and broken this tube, and this portion is still intact, and this portion is broken off and collapsed. And these very spiny, spiked ribs that have broken off are very pointed and sharp looking, and there are exactly two of these for every one of these, meaning that once it collapsed, we can see the top and bottom portions of the ribs with equal ease. That's an indication again of what these things are like. This similar thing has happened down here where a boulder has banged into this section of the tube, and the part below that has collapsed, and we see these double spaced, double frequency collapsed sections where we can see both the top and the bottom parts of the ribs on the ground, and we see that they're bent in the middle from the collapse.
With that resolution, what would you say the diameter of these tubes would be, Tom?
Typically 50 meters for the intact portion. Once they're sprawled out like this, it would be more like 100 meters. This last one shows a case of perpendicular intersections and a case of tubes networking almost in terminal fashion. That is the way our train stations on Earth tend to have terminals where lots of tubes come together from different directions at one place.
Specular reflections? That's interesting because specular reflections can only originate from a highly polished artificial surface, excluding water or any other liquid. Infrared imagery reveals now that these glassy tubes are actually connecting between all of the interesting surface features. And as Tom pointed out, that some of these tubes are very wide, they have a large diameter to them, and some of them actually are wide enough to fit 6 Greyhound buses in there side by side. And the idea of an underground transportation system isn't really too far-fetched at all, because there are vast underground tunneling and transportation systems here on Earth. For example, let's have a look at some of our own very serious tunnel boring equipment that we use here on Earth.
This is the world's largest tunnel boring machine. 2 of these were used to dig the double tunnel under the Yangtze River in Shanghai, 7.5 kilometers long. This machine is 15.42 meters in diameter, 132 meters long, and weighs 2,300 tons. Tunnel building here on Earth is more common than most people realize. Most of the entire Norwegian coastline is tunneled beneath their huge granite mountains. Imagine how much easier it would be for a far more advanced civilization to build tunnels just below the surface of Mars.
The universe is a little bit like the old German Autobahns, and that is that there are no speed limits out there, folks. And Tom is going to talk about a certain type of an effect in the universe that is actually 20 billion times faster than the speed of light.
Einstein's theories predicted that nothing could ever travel faster than light, even in principle, because motion causes time to slow down, and by the time you would approach the speed of light, time would cease advancing altogether, and therefore the light is a barrier that could not be crossed. However, we now know that there is a very similar theory developed by Lorentz, which makes the same predictions as far as what we observe, that very accurate clocks such as atomic clocks will indeed slow down as the speed at which they travel through space advances from slow to very fast. But in Lorentz's theory, it's only the clocks that are affected. Their operation slows down. Time itself is unaffected. So it's the same observable result, but a very different physical meaning, and therefore in Lorentz's theory there is no speed limit in the universe. So that means that we're free to, instead of making up very fanciful explanations for the 6 experiments about gravity, to explain how it could be that gravity seems to act almost instantaneously and yet live within the confines that it can't act faster than the speed of light. Instead of that, we have a situation where we can say, well, Lorentz actually had a better interpretation than Einstein did, and there is no speed limit, and we should take the experiments literally for what they tell us, which is that the speed of gravity can be no less than, well, the first measurement was by Laplace in 1820. He said it had to be at least 10 million times faster than the speed of light. Our most accurate modern measurement says it can be no less than 20 billion times the speed of light.
Calculations reveal that the effects of gravity are at least 20 billion times faster than the speed of light. Here's an idea. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could figure out a way how to use gravity as a communications medium since it's so fast? This might make it possible for us to communicate across the vast distances of time and space almost instantaneously. Maybe, just maybe, other more advanced civilizations are already doing that. And perhaps there are intergalactic conversations going on right now that we just haven't tuned into yet.
One of the things which Tom talks about is the speed of gravity, and there's some controversy about that because in Einstein's theory of gravity there are other effects which compensate when the target, the planet, is moving, and some of those effects counteract the distance, the time it takes for the signal to get from the planet to the receiver, and they can make it look like an instantaneous signal even though it's not. Those same effects occur in electromagnetism. So that's a controversy that I'm not sure what the answer is, but I do know that there are some other interesting effects that have been discovered recently in physics that are even faster and may be very relevant to what he's talking about. One of them is the torsion wave. The Russians, back in the 50s, began working on the science of torsion. They discovered that there is a force which is probably akin to gravity in a way, but it travels much faster, maybe 1 billion times faster than gravity or than the speed of light. And this has various consequences. It exists in concentrations in space, and when it's found in various regions of the cosmos, can actually increase or decrease the effect of gravity compared to what we would normally expect. So it's probably this force called torsion which gives rise to areas of dark matter and dark energy that have concerned astronomers in recent years. So that's just one aspect of some very interesting new science regarding gravity and the cosmos that probably factor into what he's looking at. So this new science of torsion, which is emerging and about which quite a bit has been written in the past 20 years or so by various Russian scientists, is intriguing in terms of space travel and communicating with other planets, because it does propagate so much faster than light. Work has been done using telescopes, for example, looking at the sun, which are specially designed to detect torsion, not light. In fact, they'll put a plate over the front of the telescope to keep out light and other conventional forms of energy. And when they do, they can see the torsion signature. And they find not only do you see an image where the sun is right now in the sky as we would look up at the sky and see it. And that image, of course, is the one that took 8.3 minutes to get from the sun to here. So that's the time delayed image. They also see another image of the sun, which is the instantaneous image. It's where the sun is right now in the sky if light traveled at infinite speed. And that shows that torsion actually does seem to have this property of traveling much faster than light. And they even get a third signal which propagates backwards in time. And it's an echo of the one that took time to get here. So there's an advanced and a retarded image of the sun as well as one that's instantaneous. So these are just a few indications that torsion really is a much faster signal than light. And if you wanted to communicate over large distances in space, it's a much more promising way to do it than using light to do it. So maybe in our SETI program and things like that, we should be trying to pick up the torsion signals. That might be a more interesting way to look than using for light signals. Anyway.
Many scientists believe that radio frequency or radio waves can only travel a maximum distance of 1 to 1.5 light years across space. So with our nearest neighbor, that is the nearest star, at 4 light years from here, perhaps we're wasting our time in attempting to use the radio frequency spectrum. Maybe we should be looking into torsion-type energy projection as a means of communications. After all, the Russians have been researching in this area since the 1950s and have had a great deal of success. Okay, we are next going to take a look at some very interesting images that I have discovered myself.
This is the first of 3 images of the Martian South Pole that we're going to show you. Looking in the red circle, there appears to be a rectangular containment wall casting shadows from right to left, and could be capable of collecting seasonal runoff water from the melting ice on the mountains above. Also, look closely in the upper right-hand corner of the rectangular area. There seems to be something there. It could possibly be the remains of an ancient water distribution manifold. This area, now empty and dry, possibly may have been an ancient reservoir. It's a bit faint, and if you haven't seen it yet, you will in the next few images. In this second image, again looking in the red circle, the walls casting shadow are now much easier to see. We have enlarged this image a bit and added more contrast to make the features stand out. As you look in the upper right section of the rectangular area, notice the strange object. In this third image, we have enlarged the area in the red circle, adding contrast and brightness while eliminating the color in order to make the features stand out even more. Again, notice what appears to be a structure in the upper right-hand corner of what looks like a water containment area. Perhaps this now parched and dry area was at one time the life-giving water source for those ancient monument builders. You may download this original, untouched image on our links page for your own examination at www.ufoshows.com. What good would a water containment reservoir be without a pipeline? In this next scene, notice the valley with the large green area. Is this some sort of chemical reaction, or is it vegetation? Also, look from right to left, and there appears to be a pipeline. On the left side, it's connecting to a T-junction, going to another vertically running pipe.
I hope you found this documentary as interesting as I have, and I also hope watching this has inspired you to search for yourself to explore the wonders of an ancient past on Mars, and whenever possible to demand the truth about the ancient past of Mars. And I also want to express my sincere thanks to Dr. Claude V. Swanson and also to the late Dr. Tom Van Flandern for his lifetime achievements in the fields of science and astronomy. And I'm sure that Tom's consciousness is roaming around out there somewhere in the cosmos, searching and exploring the things that he was most curious about. And so my final words to you, Tom, are happy hunting.